Welcome everyone to our Hotel Management Real Estate Development Roundtable. My name is David Eisen. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the QuestX Hospitality Group, which operates Hotel Management Magazine. We're all very glad that you were able to join us today. Before we get started, I wanted to thank the sponsor for our roundtable, Access Point Financial. John Wright is here observing, but we want to thank him for putting this on, helping us put this on today. And a special shout out. Are the kids still saying that? Shout out, I don't know, I'm not familiar with the name for it, but to Michigan State for joining us today, AJ Singh, and putting this all together. So we welcome the students. Always nice to have fresh young minds of today joining us. So with that, again, I want to thank you. We're going to go for about an hour and a half or so, talk about a lot of the trends and what's going on in hotel real estate, but also just the hotel industry in general. So what I'd like to do is do a real quick whip around the room. If you could introduce yourself, let us know who you are and your company, and then we'll go from there. So why don't we start at the end here?
Sure. Ian Davis with Lodging Capital Partners.
I'm Michael Kitchen with the Imperium Hotel Group out of Chicago.
Ryan Meliker with Canaccord Genuity.
John Keeling with Valencia Group.
Greg Osteen with Lowe's Hotels.
Jalil Mekwar with CHM Warnick.
Mitch Garrett from Trump Hotels.
Mark Laporte, Concord Hospitality.
Paul Novak with Whitman Peterson.
Great, very quick. I guess we can jump right into questions. So I guess, Mitch, I have to start with you, right? Being with Trump Hotels. What is it like working with the next leader of the free world? Is that a lot to? Well, I'll open it up, but it's nice that you were here. Just it's a nice kind of segue transition. We all know what went down a couple of days ago, and whether you're a Trump fan or a Clinton backer doesn't really matter now anymore. So, but I'd like to know. I mean, what is we have the election. We know what's happening, the outcome. There's no uncertainty who's going to be the next president of the United States. So I'd like to know if you could talk kind of generally speaking, what kind of impact do you see this having maybe on capital markets, the overall investment landscape? I know there's a lot of, when we talk about in the hospitality industry, particularly when we talk about immigration, trade, Obamacare, all these things. What do you see as kind of maybe the short and long-term impacts of a Trump presidency? And I will open it up to anyone who wants to start, or I could use the Socratic method and call on someone. But Mitch, let's start with you since you
Fair enough.
work with him.
Well, look, I mean, it's nobody has a crystal ball as to what exactly it'll be. I think the market's spoken recently in terms of the fear, so I don't think there's going to be any immediate results. And whatever, the market dropped 800, but then bounced right back up. And I think we're up 800 points in the past 5 days. So I think the consensus on the market is that they're optimistic. And if you look at, I was talking to Paul, if you look at what Mr. Trump was able to do in terms of creating a game plan and then executing it, if that's any bit of a foresight as to what his presidency will be, I think it's very optimistic looking forward. He created a game plan, went after the rest of all states. Everything he did was exactly what, or everything he had planned was exactly what he did. So if you're looking into what he's looking to do with kind of fiscal stimulus, and we're not sure exactly where that will all shake out, but I think all signs point positively.
Anyone else take the other side?
Yeah, listen, I think it's tough to crystal ball it when somebody ran a campaign that was so opaque, and so I think the forward look could be pretty bad to some extent, but could be very good to the other extent. If you look at the NAFTA, if you look at some of the trade deals he's talking about eliminating, that could be really bad for some Texas properties. 1.1 million jobs in Texas come from exports. But if you look at the opportunity for deregulation, that could have some really short-term positive impacts as well. So really, a lot I think is still to come.
There's probably very little impact next year. There's going to be a lot of excitement. There might be some anticipation of what might happen, and we might see some stimulus from that. But certainly, if they're able to get the tax reform, simplified tax law, if they're able to strangle Dodd-Frank so that lenders can lend again, then we might see a real jump in 2018. And so I'm kind of an optimist. Now, if you look at the downside, what's he going to do to treaties and that sort of thing? Well, he needs Congress to do that.
Yeah.
He can't do that on his own. And my guess is that that cooler heads in Congress will keep some of the extremeness of those kinds of proposals.
Though it's totally Republican-controlled House and Senate, so.
So why is that a problem?
Exactly, right?
That just means he can get something done.
Who's gonna get something done, right, sure. Anyone else wanna take a stab, or?
I think the one thing that we didn't talk about, which is how it can pertain directly to the hotel business, which is the idea that if Trump is going to be much harder on immigration, he could potentially be much harder on visas and tourism and bringing international inbound arrivals into the U.S. We've obviously seen a big slowdown in that over the past year, driven by the rising dollar. But I'm not saying it will, but if he pushes hard on that front, it can have a direct impact on this business.
Yeah.
Employees, a lot of our employees are entry-level jobs.
Sure.
A lot of those are filled by immigrants. That could shut down, that could be an issue. Our FF&E, a lot of it's built overseas. That can
Well,
have
I mean, that's the
impact.
point that he had made the point, I think, back in January. He told the Times that he was kind of hinted at as maybe a 45% tariff on Chinese imports. I mean, what would that do? From what I know, the hospitality industry gets all manufacturing, gets its goods from China. I mean, that would be a huge, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's more than just the hospitality industry,
Yeah,
you know.
right.
And Congress
I hate to
has
tell you, most of the furniture in your home is probably built in China.
Yeah.
So.
I build my own.
Yeah, he can't do that without Congress, and I don't see Congress going along with it, whether they're Democrat or Republican.
Mhm.
But I think it's important that he is in the hotel business. And he's well aware of the hotel business. He's well aware of tourism and the importance of tourism, you know, not only to his business, obviously, but to the whole industry. So, you know, he could look at tourism on a very favorable note and provide significant funding for the U.S. Travel Association and for other organizations to drive tourism to the U.S. So there could be that positive side.
Real quick, so we have a new entry into the roundtable. Why don't you introduce yourself, Fred, real quick?
Fred Kleissner, Independent Director and Chair of the Independent Directors Committee for Caesars Entertainment, and the same for Cambridge Hospitality and Ashford Hospitality Trust.
Glad you have it. We're just talking about Donald Trump, so.
Sorry to be late. Tying up the refinancing of $21 billion in debt at Caesars took a bit of time today.
Fair enough. So I'll leave it down unless anyone else wants to take the last word on Mr. Trump and the presidency. No, let's move on. So one of the, I wanted to bring it back to kind of just the hospitality industry, which is what we're here to talk about. So, maybe we just go around. I'd like to hear what you thought the biggest trend or storyline there was in 2016. Mark.
Of course, the one that will come to everybody's mind is this new company that Marriott and Starwood have now formed. For those of us that are developers, owners, and operators, we can't clearly see the near future. I think we're going to see positive impacts in many markets, and I think we're going to see real negativity in markets that are so dominated by the combined brands that dilution is almost certain to happen.
Mm-hmm.
That is on my team's mind daily as we develop hotels. We have 17 hotels under construction. Many of them we now have sister hotels that when we went into the development, we did not think were in our same brand. So we're excited. We think it's a little daunting, and we think there is going to be a lot of choppiness in the coming months because of that.
Mm-hmm.
To me, the Marriott-Starwood combination, while on the one hand Marriott winning was a bit of a tipping point, I don't think anyone was surprised to see Starwood in play. When the other majors announced they're going to go asset light, and they do, and the other majors announce they're going to add a brand every year or buy a brand every year, and they do, and when one of the majors doesn't do any of that, the company is going to go through a major turmoil. Minimally, the chief executive changes, and no criticism for the chief executive, That's the person who sets strategy and direction. But it was a choice, and a choice that did not work in Starwood's case. To me, the biggest headline in 2016 is the abrupt change of transactional traction as we moved from 2015 to 16. It was like a demarcation line, driven solely by a bit of an increase in interest rates, a moderate rise in the cap rates that told sellers they're better off refinancing while they can and taking whatever money they wish off the table, and moving on with life to the next end of the cycle when cap rates go down again. Today, I'm certain that we've all taken notice of the somewhat concern that with the change in administration, we'll see not accelerated, but quicker. Be quick, but don't hurry with interest rate rises would be where the head of the Fed is looking right now. That would suggest that the lack of traction for transactions in real estate are going to go down. Puts the real estate investment trusts on the defense, and my view is we'll see more consolidation. Consolidation of actual REITs, particularly hotel REITs.
I think that, similar to what Fred just talked about with transaction trends, I think interest rates are one driver of that, but I think another big driver of the slowing transaction trends has really been the lack of visibility across the industry related to RevPAR. I think if you look at every publicly traded REIT and C Corp and compare them to your businesses, what you'll see is that RevPAR expectations in February gradually drifted down, and I think just about every one of them lowered guidance 3 times this year. 3 out of 4 times. That's pretty impressive. And when you think about that fact and the idea that today's guidance for RevPAR growth for 2016 across every company is not just on the bottom half of the range that they initially guided to, but below the original range, and that lack of visibility and that lack of clarity creates a great deal of uncertainty from a buyer perspective, where you're going to price in discounts and the seller's sitting there feeling pretty good, saying, I don't need to take that discount, I can refinance. And it'll be interesting to see whether that lack of visibility persists through 2017, or if we get some level of stability going forward. Remains to be seen. I think obviously economic growth is a factor in it, but what we've seen across sluggish group demand trends and short-term group bookings not materializing, it's going to have a continued big impact on the industry if it doesn't change.
Yeah, listening to Hilton and Marriott's call, you're exactly right. That's exactly what. I mean, we talked about. You talked about transactions, and I think that their real capital, they came out with some numbers that they're down 55% from the year prior. So I mean, you talked about that's a pretty precipitous kind of fall off there, and whether that picks up in the second half, I don't.
But I think it could be a phenomenon that's going on in our business. I mean, I think that the REITs have been, in 14 and 15 were, drivers of value and price and cap rates, along with the larger, Starwood Capital and some of the other really big investors. And when they stepped out of the market in the latter part of 15, I think there are a lot of buyers out there who thought this is their opportunity to come in and swoop in and buy stuff that is significantly below what its real values are. But I don't think that's happening, because I think that the solidity of the existing ownership is such, and the cash flows, as long as the industry continues to perform, whether it's at 4% or 5% of RevPAR growth versus even the 6 and 7, still 4 or 5% of RevPAR growth annually, and even dropping to say 3 is still pretty strong for this industry. So I think what a lot of people have found is that if I can't sell for what I really think the value of my asset is, the cash flow is worth more to me than selling the asset at a, bargain basement price, because that's what's out there, are people thinking they can take advantage of the
You know,
market.
the idea that 4% RevPAR growth is a bad thing is really crazy, because the only way you get higher RevPAR growth than that is by increasing occupancy, and the industry's running at record level occupancies.
Exactly.
So 4 or 5% means rates are going up about the way they used to go up. We're just not seeing increased occupancy because you can't fill a full cup.
But wouldn't 4% be nice? I'm hearing
Yeah.
two.
That was how I was going to chime in.
You know, the components will be ever thus two components, rate and occupancy. There comes a point in time in every cycle that a focus on driving rate, even sacrificing a bit of RevPAR
Right.
to drive rate and let occupancy fall. It's a matter of managing the distribution sources toward the sources that contribute the greatest net operating income, as opposed to simply the greatest RevPAR. And you then go back to what Paul just said, and that's that, let's assume it's a 3% RevPAR environment. Managed properly, that should yield, at 3%, an increase in net operating income between 6 and 9%, and absolutely validates the point that why should you sell? The value of the cash flow exceeds your cost of capital.
I think if you take all of those factors, but also consider as the REITs left and the cross-border capital came in larger, I think last year they were 44%. And they have different investment hurdles, right? They have different capital sources and different return hurdles. So if you're a buyer and you look around, a year and a half, it's sort of like being at a party and you look around and the fun people have left, right? And like, well, why haven't I left yet? So you look at who's now there and like, wait a minute, I don't want to compete with them because they can come in and outbid me at the last minute. So
Yeah.
that, and then you factor in Airbnb. Factor in different markets, Houston's getting overbuilt, Nashville's getting overbuilt, Miami's getting overbuilt and losing their international inbound travel, or certainly decreasing significantly. So you look at some of the key markets where that capital's been going, and it's better to sit on what you have.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Maybe Ryan, I was looking at some markets yesterday. I mean, New York is the RevPAR negative. Chicago, I think. What's going on? And it's the secondary markets that we are seeing a nice bump in RevPAR, actually.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think as you look at 2016, you've seen a big bifurcation between the core urban central business district locations around the country and more of the suburban markets. And hard to explain exactly why that's happening, but the reality is you're seeing suburban RevPAR growth materially higher than urban RevPAR growth, airport RevPAR growth materially higher. And a lot of that, in my view, is because the urban locations are at peak occupancies. The reality is the industry is at a peak occupancy level. And what that creates is more compression into these suburban and airport markets where you can run at a lower occupancy number, where you're running at a lower occupancy. So you have the ability to grow occupancy and you can still raise rate at the same rate that you're raising them in the urban locations. And that's led to outsized RevPAR growth. There's an argument, I'm not sure whether I agree with it, but I think it's at least interesting, that maybe the advent of Uber has created a more willingness from the traveler to stay a little further from their destination because they know they have access to get to and from much more easily than they might have thought before. I don't know how true that is, but it's at least an interesting hypothesis. But I think as we look into 2017, what gets interesting is when you look at the major markets, New York is probably going to be down big again. And again, New York runs 89% occupancy. So, Fred, to your point that it's about how you manage the property and maximize NOI, I agree. But if all of your peers are doing it, are slashing rate, you're going to get screwed. And I think that's what we've seen in the New York market is this level of fear that has translated into RevPAR declining. All you had to do was hold rate. Demand's been there. The supply's been absorbed. It hasn't been a problem, but no pricing because if you wait long enough, somebody's going to lower their rate.
Mark, you have assets here. So
Yes.
what's going on?
Ryan hit it right on the head. So we're seeing another great year, 90 plus at our hotels, but we have no pricing power.
Why is that?
It's a combination of what's been said. It's whether it's an Airbnb and special events, The New York Marathon used to be a total sellout at huge premium rates.
Right.
Not anymore. There's just the change. OTA, of course, have helped with millennials and their brand agnosticism. They don't care whether they stay at my Marriott hotel. If they don't like the price, they'll just go on, find a better deal, and say, see ya. So there's this strange and new dynamic that is making it very, very difficult in a market like this to regain pricing power. Add, and of course, the tremendous new supply to that.
And it's interesting.
We're a couple years away at least fixing that.
No, to Mark's point, New York in particular, predictions say that next year we're looking at anywhere between 3 to 4% drop.
Yeah.
And the occupancy is gonna suffer and the rate is gonna hold, and I don't really quite believe that, because we've seen how New York reacts exactly to your point, Ryan, that you can hold rate, but you don't, because as you said, if you wait long enough, somebody's going to come and drop the rate. But what I see on a more on a national basis that could be a deterrent for investment in hospitality is the spread between the inflation and the RevPAR growth, which typically hospitality investment is a good hedge against inflation, but not anymore. We look at next year, predictions are 2.2%, what they say. And then the ADR growth is 3.1%. So and that's probably the lowest spread between inflation and the ADR growth that's been there for quite a few years. So why would I want to take a risk in an asset class that is perceived as being volatile and more risky if on top of that I'm just barely hitting inflation?
Yeah.
So that's one thing that could be a bit of a challenge.
And Mike, just really, you have parent properties in those kind of, not New York, Milwaukee. I think you have a hotel, the Iron Horse, right? I mean, what are you seeing in maybe those kind of markets that aren't in the top 5, and also in John, there's kind of these independent hotels too.
Yeah, I would say to the earlier points, I think 2016 is the year that, at least for the top 25 markets, that we kind of met equilibrium, right? So we're seeing a greater increase of supply than really demand in those markets. We actually are seeing that now 2 years out for the markets we go into, which is kind of 25 to 50 markets, where we're seeing actually a lot of anticipated supply in those markets proposed in the next 2 years. And they're starting to level out. We've held rate, but we're also so far at the top above the market rate that we can't push anymore. It kind of is what it is. So, for a market like Milwaukee, they added a Kimpton hotel, they added a Marriott hotel last year, there's 2 more hotels proposed. We're kind of just holding our ground, and we feel good about that. We're at a point in the market where we've been there for so long, we've been there for a number of years, that we've established our position, and we're just going to hold our position and continue to find operational efficiencies within that position.
Yeah, we're not too worried about where the real growth is. If you take a look at 60% of the rooms coming into the market is going to be upper mid-scale or upscale, and as long as they do that, we're fine. We compete with the upper upscale and luxury. And so to the extent that those kinds of properties come online, we have more of a problem, but those are a lot harder to build. And we don't see as many of them coming online. Although I think, about 20% or 19% of the stuff in the pipeline right now is independent. And that doesn't count the soft brands because they get counted elsewhere.
Yeah.
So those are real independents. And so we're seeing a lot of new supply. And we know that the markets where we have been king of the hill, it's harder to be king of the hill. We just had a hotel open in San Antonio. We were rated #1 last year by Condé Nast Traveler as the best hotel in San Antonio in all our markets. And then we had Hotel Emma open, $750,000 a key. They are now king of the hill. Beautiful hotel, never make any money in it, but it's just a gorgeous hotel, and it will be the king for a long, long time.
Sure.
But answer me this, John, because I'm curious what your take on it is. So let's say you're in one of those markets where you've got a new, we'll call it a Hilton Garden Inn that's opening up, and that's clearly not competitive with your properties, right? As you just said. But it is competitive with the Hilton that exists, right? And it's attracting those same brand family guests, and therefore the new Hilton Garden Inn can put pressure on Hilton pricing. And you just said that you compete with some of the upper upscale properties because they're closer. Does that have an indirect impact on your portfolio, or is it too Because it's 2 steps removed, it's not as much of an impact.
Well, the fact that it's branded gives us some comfort, because we outproduce the branded properties. I'm more afraid of an Ace or one of the Epernia hotels or somebody like, or 21C coming into the market, not the branded.
Gotcha.
We have our premium we have over the brands. Now, if the whole market goes down, and that happened to us when the dot-com implosion in San Jose, if the whole market goes down, we're not bulletproof. But what we find happens is that our premium, our percent premium over the competition actually increases. Doesn't mean we didn't go down, we just don't go down as much as the market. So in San Jose, California, in 2007, we were running 150 RevPAR penetration. In 2008, about 150. 2009, we went to 175. Now, that isn't because we suddenly went up in occupancy. We went down, but the rest of the market went down harder. And so that's what we kind of see in these marketplaces, that and I think the phenomenon is this. If you have a Hilton Garden and you have a Courtyard and you have all these hotels that are pretty much the same kind of property, and the bad stuff hits the fan, the only thing you can really compete on is price. Whereas if you're a unique property, like an Epernia or like a Valencia, and there's nothing like you else in the market, you don't have to compete. You're not bulletproof, you're not immune to it, but you don't have to discount the way the clones do.
If I could take just a bit of a contrarian view, in looking at markets that are, as a couple have said at the table, have gone into the dumpster, as far as...
Just wait till next year, Fred.
Wait till next year, exactly. However, I would agree that if a market drops like a rock, along with the occupancy potential of that marketplace, I agree, pricing becomes a significant challenge. However, in any market where you've got at least 70 sellouts a year, and certainly at 89% citywide, let's say it's 85% citywide, we're closing in on 90, 95 sellouts per year. Managing what we own and control, the inventory, becomes important. Risk takers, and I would be doing this myself right now in New York, and that is, if I'm tracking the closeout and sellout rate of my direct competitors, I would be tracking how much of the inventory I want to take risk on, to set aside, hold back inventory, track the sellout, closeout rate of my comp set, both the comp set above me, the comp set below me, and my direct comp set. And as I see that occupancy close in to the sellout of my competitors, now I sit back with the inventory that people have to have. Or they may take, it's the risk I take, the Uber scenario, interesting scenario. To move out further, maybe. I don't think so in a city top 25 MSA location. But the ability to take risk and set aside inventory for premium rates will be there if occupancy is there. It just takes a matter of reasonable risk. How much of the inventory do you want to take a chance on? I would probably nibble at it first. I'll use an off-color comparison. A great saying is that if you're going to eat a manure sandwich, it's best to nibble.
Fred, we have kids in the room.
I'd start slowly, but I would take that risk and simply track the hotels that are directly competing with me that I know are going to close out because they're panicking. When I see everyone dropping, it's the time to sit back and say, what have I got to lose?
So yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
Now remember, he's at the top of a casino company, so it's like, watch this.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's interesting, even in casinos today, what was 5 years ago 70% of EBITDA coming from gaming, now it's 70% from hospitality. Only a third of the occupancy is comp, the rest is cash. That rapport per occupied room is rising at a rate of 7 to 10% in Las Vegas right now.
And you're including entertainment
Yes.
along with the
Oh, of
F&B,
course.
right, yeah.
Oh, yes. Martians are superb, particularly in entertainment.
So what this all tells me, though, and this is kind of just how important is revenue management seems to be for your hotels. You're not paying your revenue managers enough, right? I mean, they're the people who really can make or break it right now for you.
But it's also an ownership philosophy, and if we could do anything with students coming out of hotel programs going into the industry, would be to try to teach them that when you get into a difficult time, cutting rate, like you said, Fred, is not necessarily going to create demand. And this industry has been classic at it. When things start to slow down, everybody cuts rate thinking they're going to create demand. And when you look at the overall demand has gone down, but it hasn't gone up either. And so when you cut the rate, all you're doing is giving the customer across the board a value that they really would have paid anyways, particularly when you look at the sellout nights. So this industry's got to get to a point where it starts to have a philosophy that when things turn bad, I'm not going to cut rate. I'll risk the occupancy. Granted, that's hard because your perception is you cut rate, that'll hold customers. I mean, I'd be curious to hear Mark's thought on it, as another operator. But I don't think this industry has ever won when there's been a downturn and the strategy has been cut rate, to save total demand in a market. The industry loses, customer wins, but we leave money on the table.
I agree with you philosophically.
Right.
Having lived, as a few of us here, through a few cycles, we are in the classical supply and demand business. And when demand is low and supply is high, it happens, and it will happen the next cycle and the cycle after that, just as it happens in the automobile business and the retail business. When there's too much supply, pricing is very, very difficult to hold. The logic that you cite is perfect, but fundamentally it's flawed because we're all a bunch of chickens.
I mean,
That's right.
Well, that's it. That's
But that's
there's
Right.
the human element to it.
It
That's the
is.
reality.
Exactly.
And one of the things that I think is going to be interesting, and I think that you hit the nail on the head, revenue management is important right now because we're in a period of a bit more volatility and uncertainty and challenges from an operational perspective. In 2012, 2013, you didn't really care about revenue management because everything was going up. It was a lot easier. And what's going to be interesting, and one of the markets that we're going to watch really closely in 2017 is San Francisco with the Moscone Center going under renovation. A friend of mine who works at one of those big private equity platforms, and he owns, I think he said, 6 hotels in the Bay Area. And he said he thinks the market's just going to be crushed. And the term he used, he said, most of the revenue managers in San Francisco haven't seen negative RevPAR growth. They don't know what negative RevPAR growth looks like or feels like. And he said, to use another crass term, just to get Fred out of the penalty box. He said that these guys just pull their pants down and just take it, because they're not used to it. So it'll be interesting to see just how bad San Francisco gets in a market where there isn't supply. Long-term fundamentals are great, but you have a blip that's going to impact things for a year, and how bad does it really play out?
Well, I wanted to ask about supply. I mean, what historically supply rises at the 2% clip, but we've been below historical levels for the past 4 to 5 years, right? I mean,
Since 2010.
What is and my whole thing is, and bringing it back to Wall Street, is one of the things is that Wall Street, and Brian, you can talk to this. They look at publicly traded companies, how many net unit additions, how many more hotels can you keep opening, but that at the same time isn't really good for the industry, right? So there's that kind of paradox there that I always think is interesting in the hotel industry.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the big brands, and the focus is system expansion plus RevPAR growth.
Yeah.
And if RevPAR is going to be bad, then you can make it up with system expansion.
Right.
And hopefully you can offset that with maybe some share repurchases, right? Which is what Marriott is doing and what you've seen Hyatt do, et cetera. I think but it's a challenge. It's a bifurcation. The hope is that they're going to continue to focus on growth outside of the U.S. And where they don't have as much penetration. I mean, the thing to remember about the brands is in the U.S., 70% of all hotels are branded, or all hotel rooms, and in Europe it's 30%. It's the exact opposite. You know, you've got major growth in a lot of emerging markets. You've got this, burgeoning middle class throughout Asia and Latin America. So there's a lot of opportunities for them to grow outside of the U.S. Will they continue to grow outside of the U.S. and not impact the U.S. industry? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
They'll continue to grow in the U.S. too, and it will make things more challenging. But ultimately, it all comes down to the developers and the money. What people never realize about the hotel industry. If I asked everybody in this room 5 years ago what the market with the biggest barriers to entry is for supply, what would you guys have said?
San Francisco.
Or Manhattan, right?
Manhattan.
Right? Manhattan's got the most supply right now, right? By far. Because money is the big barrier to entry. It's all about where the capital is. And as long as developers can still finance things and developers can get access to that capital, they'll continue to develop and the brands will be happy to support that. So that's the big driver more than anything else.
You are all close to the lenders and lending markets. What are you seeing there?
They're tightening. We do all new construction, so
Yeah.
we're into construction already. And we used to be able to get by with maybe 45% equity now, or 40% equity. Now we're up at 45. We can still get deals done, but they're a higher equity component than we've had in the past.
That's good news. We're not going back to the lunacy of sale-leaseback schemes. There's nothing more than 100% financing with no equity. If you do it at the wrong time, you end up at 120% financing, the way people found themselves in the last cycle. The fact is 80% financing is not available, won't be, and the fact that it's getting tighter is a good message. We've cruised through sub 2% supply growth for some time. The markets have not inverted with regard to supply and demand in, what, you're talking 65 plus months. In general, we can over-concentrate a bit on markets like Miami, San Francisco, and New York, but as we look across the country, right now the phenomena that's not there is high leverage with low equity. Says people are going to go bye-bye when the bottom falls out. And secondly, we don't see the supply-driven growth that has precipitated the last few changes in the cycle. If you look back at the cycle that changed in 1990, it was driven by the syndications of the late 80s and the Economic Recovery Act of 87. If we look at what drove the cycle to go upside down in early 2001, it was the same growth cycle of easy supply coming online, and we haven't seen that in this sluggish, slow growth cycle. But right now, if we top 2% next year, it's not terrible. If we start closing in on 3% plus, that's the time to tighten chin straps and be ready.
Yeah, we're in the market right now for some loans and all. I totally agree with Fred. I can't go back as many cycles as Fred just did, but I can tell you that the current lending environment there's a lot of discipline in it, and I think it's driven by the credit officers of the bank. And having been a lender back in the last cycle, I can tell you it's very different, and they're capping out the loan to values. They're looking at the cash outs. They're looking at all the stuff they should be looking at, and so it's kind of encouraging. It's tough to get political to see how what that's going to look like as we go into this next administration. But right now, a lot of checks and balances on the capital markets.
Talking interest rates in December, are we looking 25 basis points? You think they will go up? I mean, even that's negligible, right? Wouldn't even have that much. What do you think for that? where interest rates are going to go in the near future?
They are creeping upward for sure. We don't know at what velocity, but let's face it, we're still at historically low interest rate times and environment, which I remember building new hotels when we were borrowing at 9% and thinking, got it done. Now we're getting it done at 210 over LIBOR, no floor. It's just craziness. In fact, a lot of what's happening in the market, Paul and I spoke before this meeting, is crazy. There is market by market, there's a lot of choppiness. What happens in New York is way different than happens in Columbus, Ohio.
It sounds like the election.
Yeah, it's just, and I think we're going to see more of that. Whether it's dumb prices being paid in Manhattan still, not too hard to get deals done in some markets at all. Where others, we're still seeing 6-7% real RevPAR growth, and it's fun. So way different than it was 24 months ago.
I think the real challenge with development over the next probably 12 to 24 months is the ability, if you've got the wherewithal, the sponsorship to really finance something, is being able to sort through the supply increases and what's really going to happen or what's not going to happen. I mean, we're clearly seeing projects that have been on the board for a year now that still aren't out of the ground, that are now we're now hearing they're falling down, they're falling apart, they're dead. So the challenge is, if you've got a really good project, you've got a good sponsor, there's a demand for that project, how do you manipulate through the system? Because I don't think we will see 3% supply increases based on the way things are falling out, which is great for those that can get deals done, but then there's still that number out there that the lenders are looking at that, aren't judging whether or not those deals are going to happen or not. And they could kill a lot of deals that really should be done because they're good sponsors and the economics make sense. So I think that's really a huge challenge over the next 12 to 24 months.
You have to have a lender relationship. You can't walk in cold.
Sure.
Where's the bank? Oh, it's down the street. If you don't have a relationship with that lender, you're in this environment, you probably are shut out. Now,
Right.
what the good news is the banking industry is pretty fluid, and people that were at the bank you had the relationship with are moving to other banks. Now you have another relationship. So that's been good for us. But we only, right at this point, bank with people we've banked with before.
What are the deals, I'm interested, that are getting done? You talked about strong sponsorship, but I was on listening to, we talked about full service, select service still is that kind of segment that's still where a lot of the activity is. On Choice's Q3 call, Steve Joyce talked about that, the full service 200 room suburban hotel is dead. Like you're never gonna see those being built anymore. That's what he said. His words, not mine. Is that fair to say?
Yes and no, because if you're talking about the hotel that's out by the freeway or in the industrial office park or whatever, okay, I agree with that. But if you're talking about a suburban hotel that's in a lifestyle mixed-use center in the suburbs, and provided there's demand generators for hotels at all there, people want to be in walkable neighborhoods, and you can do that in downtowns. You can also do that in lifestyle mixed use. And Real Capital Analytics did an interesting study in the most recent report where they looked at cap rates. Those hotels that were in walkable neighborhoods and those that weren't, and there was at least 100 basis point lower cap rate for hotels that were located in walkable neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And that was just somebody had a lot of time on his hand and went back and looked at walkability indices for all the various locations and did this beautiful chart. And so I would say, as long as you've got the right kind of surroundings where you're in a walkable neighborhood, even in the suburbs, and you're not just another stamped out clone, I think you'll be fine.
I think part of it is, how do you define full service?
Yeah, that's,
I mean,
that's a good question.
and that's a good question.
Is full service a restaurant?
Right, it's
You
a
know,
restaurant, right? Three meal.
Or
Yeah,
is
meeting
full
space.
service, Bellman, Dorman, 10,000 square feet of meeting space,
Right.
you know, a concierge level, and that kind of thing. Then I think the question of supportability of that kind of a product in a suburban market, there might be some, but it's probably fairly thin,
Yeah.
as opposed to, you know, a 160 room lifestyle hotel with, you know, with a bar, restaurant. Yeah, those are not gonna, those are still supportable.
Isn't every hotel nowadays a lifestyle hotel?
Sure.
Just about.
Courtyard is a lifestyle, I mean.
Everyone is,
all that works.
every one of them is authentic.
Yeah, exactly, and there's an experience. and all-
It's a local
You raise a good point, but one thing I'd ask, you know, those of you that operate full-service hotels and select-service hotels, what's the margin differential?
Huge.
Huge. So in a suburban market, what's the rate differential between a traditional full-service Hilton or Marriott and the Courtyard or Hilton Garden Inn?
Yeah, but that's the key
Right,
word,
no, I agree.
traditional.
I agree.
Could be
Well, I'm talking
reversed.
traditional. I'm not talking
The
anything else.
Courtyard could be higher than the Marriott.
So if you've got a margin that might be 1,000, 1,500 basis points higher, and you have a rate differential that is only 5 or 10%, who in their right mind would ever build a new Hilton or Marriott as opposed to the Courtyard or Hilton Garden Inn? So in response to your question earlier, I think Steve Joyce is 100% correct related to those types of full-service hotels in suburban markets.
Yeah.
I think when you get into boutique and niche and lifestyle and more luxury-oriented properties that maybe have a demand driver there, it's a whole other ballgame.
But it still requires the right kind of site. You can't even take a
And
kitschy boutique
market.
hotel and put it in the middle of a medical center. It isn't gonna fly.
Sure.
Site
That's fair.
and market.
Mitch, and you guys have been Trump luxury full-service hotels, and now you're branching out into the lifestyle arena with Scion. I mean, what is obviously the new CEO there, Eric Danzer, he's all about forward momentum and big ideas. So, what was the impetus, the drive behind launching this new lifestyle brand?
Well, it's capturing a totally different market share. So the luxury user, the luxury customer is totally different from what we're seeing as majority of millennials or the psychographic really based, not more of an age thing. But to your point, yes. So we're the new brand, the Scion brand that we're creating is predominantly urban core focused, but we are in our pipeline having some new mixed use developments that are actually adjacent to some of these suburban areas that you're mentioning, but they have other demand drivers, they have other density factors in there that make it a destination for the local community. Then that maybe they don't have many other options around there for something that's cool and hip or whatever you want to call it, but we need that anchor. We're not just going to put it, and we're not just going to take a DoubleTree and convert it and say this is a cooler product. Right. You need to have something else to it that gives it that panache for a reason for somebody to come in there.
There was the two things you need to be successful. You need in a suburban location. One is you need a site, which is a walkable neighborhood. The other thing you need is a market, which means there's demand. You can have the coolest site with all kinds of retail and neat stuff. You put a hotel there, it'll die because there's no demand generators around it. And we've seen a number of those, which is a gorgeous site. I'd love to have a hotel there, but who's going to stay there?
Right.
So you got to have both. You got to have the site and you got to have the market. And some people fall in love with the site and forget about the fact that even a great hotel needs to have demand generators nearby.
Well, you talked. I mean, and it's just. I mean, cities are shifting, right? Cities are becoming smarter, and there's this cities are. I don't know if you want to call it gentrification, what have you, but I mean, the places that weren't really inhabitable before, they are now. There's more stores that are popping up. There's more, families moving in. I mean, it's pretty fluid in that regard too. So you have to keep track of that.
What's happening is the Brooklynization of the country.
Brooklynization.
And
Hipster.
Well, and here's what it is. It's Oakland.
Yeah.
Oakland is the Brooklyn of San Francisco.
Yeah.
It's
Oakland is the Brooklyn of San Francisco.
it's.
You heard it here first.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just saying,
It should be so
when a market gets so expensive and so prohibitive, that people still want to be close to that, but they can't quite get there.
That's why I live in Queens.
So exactly. So what happens is you have the Brooklynization. You have people who go into the next neighborhood, and maybe it's a slum, maybe it's an industrial crappy
we
place.
saw that with in Brooklyn. You talk about everyone moved to Williamsburg, and that became too expensive. Then they moved to Bushwick. has become too expensive.
It's Greenpoint.
So, yeah, the Greenpoint, they're all, yeah.
Look at Long Island City 5 years ago to today.
Yeah.
5 years
There's a
ago,
lot of
you
hotels
would never go there.
There's an overall
Yeah.
shift to the urban core no matter where you go. When we launched the company, it was in 2012. What we saw in Portland, Nashville, Austin, we knew was going to carry through. And it's not post-grad millennials. It's actually now empty nest boomers. They're the ones actually driving up pricing
Really?
in the urban core.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The ability to close cash same day and pay record per square foot prices,
Yeah.
even renting.
Right.
So for us, to see that now, we felt this was going to happen in Kansas City, in Des Moines, in Detroit. These markets are 99% rental occupancy downtown. You can't build residential fast enough, residential fast enough in these markets. And that's spreading everywhere. That's just the world we live in right now. The Brooklynization is a good way of putting it, but the overall shift to the urban core is going to happen as far as we can see into the future.
And that's why it's a psychographic trend, not a
Yeah,
age.
it's a psychographic trend, not.
But the hotels don't lead it. It's the
No, they have to
multifamily and retail that leads it, and some office, and then the hotels are follow. So you can't
Apartments lead it because
create-
everything follows,
Apartments are-
because everybody follows the money.
Right.
If you look at Cherry Creek outside of Denver, you'll see that exact phenomenon going on. The apartments, the condos, the expansion of the Cherry Creek Mall into a town center atmosphere, and then the emergence of independent lifestyle hotels that are coming in with great strength. The point that was made, though, on demand generators should not be breezed over. And not just how many, it's the breadth and the depth. I can remember opening a terrific 350-room Marriott hotel in Minnetonka, Minnesota. The demand generators were there, but there were only 3. And what happened?
And were they all the same industry?
No. It
That's
was
good.
Cargill, it was 3M, and it was Minnetonka.
Well, now it's United Health.
Yeah, it's United
The
Health.
problem is, you're at their mercy at that point.
Mhm.
Having the breadth of demand generation and a strong basis of multiple key feeder cities to reach into, to broaden the sources of business and that's part and parcel of the market study that justifies whether or not the thesis that can never happen or that can always happen, or maybe somewhere in between.
We now own that hotel.
So you really, God bless
So you follow the residential market, is what it sounds like. That's the kind of flow, that's the start, and that's kind of.
But you don't trace right after it. You gotta wait until you have enough density.
Yeah.
So that might take a while.
It's not really the residential market. I mean, I was staying in Chelsea last night, and you look at, it's, started with galleries and really nothing else. That's
Yeah.
the first thing, true artists.
Right.
And then you start talking second wave artists or second wave creative companies. And that's what you want to get. You want to get in a neighborhood before there's a Starbucks, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you look at what's office in there. I was walking around, and it's La Colombe's office for coffee. It's Uber has an office there. For us, we go, when we're looking in Pittsburgh, we're looking in the Strip because Uber was moving their offices there. West of Chicago's exploded because of Google moved their offices there. Now you have a Hawks and an Ace and a Soho.
Yeah.
And everybody else will come as a result of that. So it's really kind of finding those kind of first things that are happening and then migrating towards that. In Minneapolis, we're opening a hotel next week in the North Loop, the first hotel in the North Loop. And lenders kind of had a fit because you're not on the Skyway, and what's your demand? Well, a Shinola opened across the street. It's all your James Beard award-winning restaurants.
Right.
Residential occupancy is the right psychographic at 99%. That checks all of our boxes,
Yeah.
and then we have to convince them that it checks theirs.
You just brought up Pittsburgh. I mean, that's a market right there that's already gotten to a critical mass, right? Already in a quick amount of time. That there's.
Well, the reason you need to go in early is so you can afford to buy the site. If you wait too long, then all of a sudden you get priced out.
Yeah.
You look at Nashville, you look at Austin, really strong markets. But they want $300 a foot in Austin.
Yeah, it's crazy. We're buying in markets like Detroit, markets like the North Loop, markets like Kansas City at $30 to $70 a square foot. Pittsburgh's 150 even to 200 now. So that's a big part of it. So.
Tremonti Brothers. Good sandwich.
I was gonna say, I grew up in Pittsburgh. I don't know if it was a quick rise, because it took a while to get there.
Right, but I think it's kind of it's one of those hip kind of
Yeah.
cities
Right.
that everybody talks about. I mean, the beautiful downtown area, the stadiums that are there, that kind of thing.
It's the media driving it. The media wants to talk about these great secondary
Yeah.
markets, right? So Condé Nast named, or maybe Food and Wine named Pittsburgh the best food city in the country last year. It's not the best food city in the country. GQ named Providence the coolest market in the. Providence isn't the coolest market in the city, but the fact that media is pointing out, they're just sick of talking about New York, Chicago, LA, et cetera. Or if they are talking about those markets, they're talking about Silver Lake or downtown in LA, or they're talking about West Loop in Chicago, or what might have you. So media is artificially driving it a little bit. That's not a bad thing.
I also think to John's point earlier, the location, the site really needs to be, it's a risk in these secondary markets, right? So if you say that Nashville or Pittsburgh is growing, that doesn't mean you can go on Mount Washington and just put a hotel and it's in Pittsburgh and that's a great idea. You need to make sure, like you said, you know the micro location within that burgeoning city is appropriate for what the product you're putting there.
Right. What about, building hotels now, how important is brand nowadays? I mean, you can see, you can do, particularly, these major markets in New York and San Francisco, do you need a brand anymore? Why, I mean, just what is the value of brand is what I'm saying.
I think it's a question of what segment are you in. If you're a luxury or upper upscale, the need for a brand may not be as apparent. If you're below that, you probably do need a brand. If you're over 400 rooms in your group-oriented hotel, you probably need a brand.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's should you be branded, should you not. I think it's project by project. But I think if you're upper upscale and you've got a great location, and you have a brand, you're probably paying too much for your reservations, because I don't think you need to do that.
I would argue that the big brands that fit that box are going to struggle for relevance
I
going
agree.
forward.
I agree.
The
You know what's going to kill them? The soft brands. You know, we have a hotel in Kansas City, and they had the Raphael, which was the other independent hotel, and they were our main competitor when we opened up. And they became an autograph.
Yeah.
Didn't touch us at all. It didn't affect us at all. But it did affect the Marriott box down the street.
Sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
And
It's like cannibalism.
So these big boxes are going to get hammered by the soft brands of their own companies.
Right.
But
It's interesting that last year and also going into 2017, the category of hotels that is showing the highest ADR RevPAR growth is actually independents. Way above. I mean, way
Yeah,
above.
but
Everything is relative. Everything is.
The problem
relative.
is, like, the STR data on independence is,
Is skewed.
yeah,
But-
I mean, I would say, you look at, Independence also said that, I think Independence in 3Q were up 6% RevPAR growth, and you look at a like LA, the Sal hotels,
Yeah.
and Pebblebrook, which are heavily skewed towards Independence, and they're
Yeah.
flat. And it just highlights that, looking at the chain, first of all, looking at the chain scale segments alone is the wrong way to ever think about RevPAR, because RevPAR is market by market more
Right.
than segment by segment. But I think the independence also more than, isn't one segment. You've got Joe's Motel out on the highway that is classified as independent. You've got you've got the independent hotel that was deflagged from a Marriott out by the airport, and then you've got the trendier boutique hotels. And frankly, the trendier boutique hotels are a smaller component of that independent segment than the other two.
Yeah, CBRE just came out with a study of the boutique industry, and I thought it was done. Well, of course, we worked on it. I was on the board of the
You're a little biased.
boutique lifestyle. Well, it needed to be done, and so they've got all of the branded independents in a group, and that would be, I guess, your Ondas and your W's and that. Then they had the soft
Branded independence. That's right.
branded
Well, branded
independent,
boutiques.
branded boutiques.
Right.
And then you had your soft brands, and you know who they are. And then they had a group that called referral groups, which is really truly independent, and it's people like small luxury hotels and Preferred and that. And they truly are independent.
Yeah.
And then they had what they called upper upscale and luxury, which are the chains like Ace and Valencia and Apernia and those. And when they get a large enough sample size, they'll break them out by chain scale as well. They just didn't have enough sample size this first pass. But we're starting to get some good data. I don't think you look to Smith for that, because I think they'd have to, because if you just had a category called independent, it's cats and dogs.
Yeah.
You got to slice it and dice it, and CBRE is starting to do that now. And at each quarter, they're going to bring it out quarterly. Each quarter, when they when they come out with their next one, you're gonna see that it's gonna be more refined and better information over time.
You know, we've been referencing RevPAR, and we just referenced the STR. Do we realize that STAR is a model from 1987 that was driven by the big brands who had just emerged from 10 years of fighting the DOJ on antitrust issues? It was a solution for that and that alone. That model hasn't changed one bit. It is we accept input, whatever it is, and we put it out in raw data on a blind comparison basis. If we are not tracking net RevPAR based on the actual net operating income yield of each distribution system with which we have associated our inventory, we're making a huge mistake. That's why asset managers today are walking into meetings with management companies saying, the RevPAR's up, big deal. My NOI is flat or down. Why? It's because the selection of the distribution system is wrong and we're paying too much attention to a 1987-88 model.
But we did have
That's your Randy Smith.
We did have that information if you go back into the 70s with with HKF and L&H that did do the annual reports of operating statistics by region, by size. When's the last time that report or something of that nature has been reported? That's all missing now. And we did have that. I
Smith
mean,
Travel
John
Research
and I
publishes it.
were both
Yeah, the host report.
with consulting firms doing that, feasibility studies and pulling that data together. Nobody collects that financial data anymore and reports it. The other thing is the STAR is changing now because of the Marriott-Starwood merger, and it's becoming very problematic on competitive sets.
It's less clear than
Because
ever.
you
It's harder and
now,
harder.
we're having to take product out of our competitive set
Sure.
and add product that is in no way competitive to our properties. Things like, a courtyard, a Holiday Express or an Extended Stay America, in order to get the
Exactly.
proper mix
Right.
without being overly concentrated with / Marriott Starwood, which is now considered in Star's mind a single brand. So
Have they-
Star is becoming far less valuable,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Data analytics is going to drive success in the future, and it's little companies that, how many have heard of Calibri Labs? Calibri Labs is reverse engineering. They're scraping data from consumer sites. They can tell you the relevance of Airbnb's data, not the hand-wringing that we hear in hotel circles, but actual factual data that's the product of simply brilliant minds that have the ability to scrape data for the hotel industry the way companies like, I believe it's ARI, that have done this for years for the consumer product industry. We're finally going to come of age in the area of data analytics that work from a revenue standpoint and the components of what drives our the efficient use of a declining inventory industry and the net operating income that yields a return on invested capital.
You brought up, you said Airbnb, so I figured that's a good segue. So I have to ask because I'm not doing my job if I don't, because at every hotel industry conference that we hear about, it's millennials and Airbnb. So as hotel operators, as owners of hotels, are you fearful of Airbnb? I mean, there's obviously, we've seen what's happening in New York, passing a law that makes it really tough on someone to operate an Airbnb without incurring these huge fines. But I mean, how as an industry, do you think we're the AHLA doing enough to curb Airbnb, and is there kind of trepidation on your part, as we look at Airbnb going forward?
To us, it's a market by market kind of statement I'd have to make regarding it. In Raleigh, North Carolina, impact is negligible. In a place called Manhattan, it can be really big. legislation has been good for our side lately in moving our direction, but what is Airbnb's net market cap now?
Higher than
30
So clearly, people that are smarter than I see a future in this business, but I think it makes a lot of noise in big cities, and probably in the coming decade will be a very important part of the lodging industry.
Yeah, I mean, one person, I forgot his name, I was speaking with MCR Development, their CEO, Tyler Morrison. He was saying he looks at Airbnb 5 years from now, it's just another OTA. So
They have an impact also on events.
Yeah.
So when you have South by Southwest in Austin, or you have the Pope visiting Philadelphia, or you have, whatever, they'll have an impact on events. But our market niche is we sell experience and service, and Airbnb doesn't challenge us. But probably, during South by Southwest in our Austin property, we might get some.
Look at their reactions.
Well, can I ask you a question? You brought up another word, the experience, and every hotelier I talk to, they always throw out the word experience in my eyes. Start to glaze, because to me, an experience isn't, people. I've heard people say like, oh, we have a welcome experience when you come to the hotel, and that invariably is maybe some water with some lemon in it and a nice hello. That's not really an experience. Now, my whole thinking is, and this is another thing to talk about, is that it's the loyalty programs that really create these experiences.
So wrong.
No, wrong there?
So wrong.
Well, I was, what I was saying was, for instance, SPG, they have their SPG moments, and I was seeing one where a gentleman cashed in 1 million SPG points for the chance to throw out a first pitch at the Game 7 of the World Series. That to me is a real experience. Walking into a hotel and having water infused with lemon, that's not.
Well, you can't define the experience as inside the four walls of the hotel.
Right.
So the real experience is going to be more than just what goes on in the hotel. What goes on in the hotel is very important. How active is your bar? What kind of entertainment do you have? How good is your food and your service? But on top of that, what's around you, and what makes that location special, and that's part of the experience. And so when I say we're all about experience, we won't even consider a site that doesn't have something that adds to the experience of the guest, a walkable neighborhood where, I don't care if you get there by Uber or you drive yourself or how you get there. Once you're there, you don't need it anymore because you can walk, you can do stuff, you can get around. That's part of the experience. It's not just inside the four walls. If you're trying to sit out in the middle of a desert and make an experience happen inside your building, it's not going to work for you.
The problem is there's no barriers to entry to create an experience.
No, there's barriers to entry in the sense that
There's barriers to
there's
entry
only so
to
many
finding
sites.
the real estate.
Mhm.
Granted, but if you find the real estate, there is no barrier to entrance to create that neighborhood experience.
Right.
Anybody can do it. I mean, anybody's good at doing
Yeah, 'cause
what they do operationally, but experience is going to end up being saturated, in my opinion. It doesn't take anything away from the value and the character and the need for that product, okay? Because it is certainly the direction this industry is going. But it's easy to duplicate if you can get the real estate.
But isn't Airbnb sort of selling an individual experience more than?
They're trying to.
I think it depends on what experience you're looking for, right? So if you're taking your family on a vacation and you want to rent the whole house, it's a great experience. If you're going to a lodging conference in Arizona and you're late edition like I was and you book something on Airbnb, that's not a good experience. It's an experience, but it's not a good one. You're staying off.
It's still experience.
So the hotel has an advantage because it's service, right?
Right.
Airbnb was, my first thought was, oh, here's a 2-bedroom, 2-bath condo, it's a mile from the hotel, and it's half what the hotel's charging if the hotel wasn't sold out. But then you have to drive back and forth to Valley Park, and it never looks as good. It's never as good as it looks in the pictures, right? It's kind of like those LinkedIn pictures, from 20 years ago.
And there's a risk I had never even considered, and that is, we had a friend who was up here about 3 or 4 months ago, and they stayed in an Airbnb and he came down with bed bugs.
Yeah, that's not a good experience.
It's not a good experience.
That is an experience.
Well, look, I think that one thing that I'd say when you talk about Airbnb is I think there's two tails of Airbnb. There's the public side of Airbnb, which is that experience and that live like a local or travel like a local dynamic. which is obviously what they pitch and what they want. And then you have the reality, and you go to any of the data sites, whether it's AirDNA or Inside Airbnb or any of them, what you find is that over 50% of all their revenues are coming from professional landlords. And you know, like I saw an expose on a San Francisco news station, you know, one of those, like, you know, digging into the story dynamics, and they followed tourists they're checking into an Airbnb, and they walked into an apartment, and the apartment had nothing on the walls except on each door there was a number: bedroom 1, bedroom 2, and bedroom 3. And they were renting the unit out by the room. You know, the reality is
Smart revenue management.
yeah. Well, hey, I mean, the reality is regulation across Airbnb is going to materialize in a big way. We saw, you know, earlier this week, the U.S. federal judge ruled against Airbnb in the case against San Francisco. We've had multiple letters to the FTC, including from Elizabeth Warren, looking for, because it's an affordable housing issue in these major urban locations. Now, Airbnb is not going to have an impact in Raleigh, and it's not going to get regulated heavily in Raleigh. But in markets where it does have an impact, and we did a piece a year ago on the impact of Airbnb, and it's very skewed towards core, high-density urban locations that have high rents and high leisure demand for travel. New York, San Francisco, LA, New Orleans, Miami, right? Those are markets where it has a big impact. Minneapolis, not so much. You know, and I think what you see in a lot of those markets is it's going to get addressed in a pretty major way, and it could get addressed nationally, because of the one lobby you don't mess with in the U.S. is affordable housing. That is the one, and I think that's what's going on. And you know, Airbnb, I think they would have been in their best interest to self-regulate and try to defer governmental regulation longer, but they didn't want to do that because that $30 billion valuation isn't based on that guy, you renting out your spare room. It's based on that 50% of revenues coming from the professional landlords. Equity Residential here in New York is being sued by their tenant base of one of their buildings because they claim that a third of the units were not refilled in the building and were just leased out on Airbnb.
You know, Airbnb, to that, you know, Airbnb also, there's no food and beverage component, right? So for us, the experience is completely driven by the food and beverage. And it's not, I mean, we might do 40 or 50% of our revenue in food and beverage. You know, the margin isn't as great, but for us, it's, you know, how do you relate to the locals? Locals don't need a hotel. They want great restaurants. But if we can get locals in the hotel, then we get local relevancy. Local relevancy yields grassroots word-of-mouth marketing, which yields direct bookings, which yields higher rate, which yields higher margin. So everything kind of comes down to that experience that we're creating for the locals in the food and beverage for us to accomplish 150% rate penetration in the market. And Airbnb can't compete on that. It competes with the commoditized hotel room selling of a room, not necessarily that whole experience in the food and beverage component you get with it. They just can't do that. Airbnb in this market can't compete with the Nomad Hotel, because if you're going to the Nomad Hotel, you want to eat at the Nomad restaurant, and you want all those pieces, you want to be there. It just doesn't compete.
Mm-hmm. David, a point we should make, though, because maybe the uniqueness of this panel, something a little bit daunting to me is the fact that, back to your brand and relevancy, between Hilton, Marriott, and IHG, there's almost 4,000 approvals in select service alone in North America. So clearly that doesn't represent, although I've built a lot of select service hotels, but more in the upscale, but they're being done, and they're being done in spades much more actively than we can talk about in this panel, because that's where most of the development is going. It underwrites, it's a safe investment in many ways, and it is becoming cannibalistic again, I think, in this downturn that we're seeing in some markets, which is what keeps me up at night.
But is that a compounded problem with Airbnb too? Like, you've got this wave of new supply coming in line, right? And you've got this zero barrier to entry format with Airbnb. If, you know, forget about the professionals. If I'm, you know, a condo owner, I'm going through some tough times because I just lost my job. I want to rent out my place when the World Series comes to town, and I throw it on. So when the market gets tougher, do you expect more people to kind of employ that format to make the rent payment? just when the hotels are going down, then you've got this new shadow supply that's going up.
I think that's right. I think that's what a lot of people are doing. And you see the inventory in Airbnb go up and down. People try it for a while, and people meaning the folks that are renting it, that are offering their space. And I think as the market goes down, more people will.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't affect us as much because, to your point about food and beverage, we're mostly group hotels. So we're targeting the groups for our meeting space. But for a leisure component, that would be work.
You asked about American Hotel and Lodging Association. My view, Catherine Luger has done an awesome job in positioning a voice for this industry. We have never had a voice in Washington until she came into the picture and brought a new team. The way she has, in a proper way, without bluster and discounting, has attacked the situation, dealing with what are illegal hotel license operators in the city of New York or San Francisco, wherever, has just been terrific.
Yeah, she has done very good.
Well, now you have the highest voice as a hotelier in Washington.
There you go.
That's right.
Very good point. I wanted to ask about, then we're talking about kind of briefly about OTAs, Expedia is the lower price line. A lot of people saw the whole Starwood Marriott merger as kind of, they would have that powered negotiation with the OTAs. What do you think, what are your thoughts on the whole distribution landscape now? I mean, all the brands have really made this push for direct business through their loyalty programs, offering discounted rates, that kind of thing. Is it working? Have you seen any anecdotal information out there that the brands are succeeding in kind of weaning their customers off booking through third parties?
With those best global brands, you mentioned Marwood, we are starting to see some wins as a very active. We have 60-some Marriotts in our portfolio. It's definitely, the corner is turning. Not fast, but it is turning. They are making real inroads in the negotiations, and if there's any win that I see for those of us that invest in those hotels, that's where they can really be powerful for, as an advocate for my investment.
Right.
Of course, what we always worry about is when they go from 16 to 13 to 12% commissions, they're just going to charge it another way. So we still are going to pay it in royalties or whatever. But we are seeing.
Way to be optimistic.
Yeah, just got to be cynical about this, guys. But I think they're in an ideal position to make a difference, and we just have to hope that the smaller franchisors, the Choices and Hyatts, can leverage their success.
Right.
It's going to happen.
You were talking earlier about the brand equity or the brand value,
Right, sure.
and I think, and to your point, Fred, and I think to me the critical brand value and is to reduce the cost of acquisition of a guest.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Mark is saying is we're just diverting from the 20% we used to pay to Expedia or Booking.com to another hidden way of paying fees through franchise or this and that. And to your point, being asset managers, I just came out of a budget meeting this morning, and the director of sales and marketing and the GM was looking at me with like a deer in the headlight, because I was talking about net RevPAR, and I was saying, what's the cost of this channel? And I said, I don't care if you drop your RevPAR next year. What do you mean? I said, I don't care. But what I do care about is you knowing that how much does this cost you and how much does this cost you. And we spend an hour and a half not talking about saving costs in here or how many heads are you going to chop or we talked about an hour and a half of how to maximize net RevPAR. And it's not something that they like to talk about because they just don't.
They don't get paid on net RevPAR, they get paid on RevPAR.
Exactly. And that, it's funny because I was just suggesting to have the GM's bonus attached to net RevPAR as opposed to that didn't go down well, but
That's how we
I would keep driving that point.
well, there you go.
The issue of the cost of customer acquisition, particularly as we see the OTAs have morphed since 2002 when we all got screwed and dumped our inventories, panicking after 9/11. But now we've morphed into these huge meta search engines. We need to be watching what Google's doing with Google search and checking it as much as we finally got around to checking TripAdvisor as they morphed into an OTA and kind of stealthily did it. Now, we've moved from primarily in the United States, a merchant model to a combination merchant and commission model. I don't think a single hotelier in the United States understood what the actual cost of acquisition in a merchant model was, because Expedia never told us. We knew there was a commission involved. We knew if there was a 72-hour sale, it was a little more, and we got some more business. No one tracked this. If we're not tracking exactly what you've said, this entire real estate model falls apart, for sure.
I have a conspiracy theory on that, because to your point, STR really grew because it was supported by all the brands, because everybody needed that for the reasons you mentioned. But when you talk to the brands about net RevPAR, they're not too hot about really digging into that, because obviously that will uncover that the net part of the RevPAr
Everything
goes
they're
in the
hiding.
pocket.
Right.
Exactly. So they're not going to support Calibri Labs, for whom I have great respect and doing great work on that. Yeah, well, I don't know if they're supporting Cindy or not, or hard enough, but that's certainly something that the industry should come together around, because I think that's the key thing for the years to come. Because revenue management, yes, but I'd rather see a revenue manager understanding about net RevPAR than just RevPAR. Right. Because then who cares? You can go and pay 50% commission or something. Oh yeah, great! I have a better RevPAR. Yeah, sure. But doesn't mean it goes to the bottom line. So.
I know we're a little bit past, but we started late, so that's okay, right, guys? You guys are okay. I wanted to ask this question. We're almost at the end, but I wanted to ask. This is a real estate kind of focused roundtable, and I wanted to ask about cross-border investment. We've seen so much capital coming particularly from China, buying up assets at right across the street at $1.95 billion. On bond buys the Waldorf. We've seen these investments from H&A Group. What's going on with Blackstone. There's a lot of that coming up from China. Is this going to be the continuation in 17? And I'd like it started there buying trophy assets, buying hotel companies. Are we going to see it move down more into the portfolio select service? I mean, what is the kind of trend there as you see it with cross-border?
We already saw it move into the portfolio select service with the Starwood Capital sale a few weeks ago to China Life at, I think what was so amazing about that portfolio of select service was not only that it was foreign life capital money buying portfolio of select service hotels in secondary markets, mind you, with I think I heard average RevPAR was somewhere around $75, but they paid a 7.5 cap for it.
Yeah.
So, I think that the reality is the Chinese have already moved into that array, and I think there's a huge opportunity for them in that landscape if they want to continue to grow in that landscape, and that's good for everybody that owns select service hotels in secondary markets.
I'd love that transaction.
And it probably will keep happening, and the biggest reason why it will is these Chinese asset managers have a mandate to invest outside of China, and they like real estate and they like hotels.
And they like the U.S.
And they like the U.S. And that's going to continue to unfold. Are we going to see another deal like the China Life acquisition of that select service portfolio from Starwood Capital? I don't know. I bet we will.
I think so, yeah.
I bet we will. And I bet we'll see a lot more things like the Waldorf, maybe not at,
And H&A buying into Hilton.
Yeah, H&A buying into Hilton. I mean, I think H&A arguably wanted to buy into a few different hotel companies. So not that surprising that they're buying into Hilton, especially with Blackstone wanting to exit. So it makes some sense. I think H&A will have difficulty buying more, especially because they're holding on to the 25% component of the REIT, which really limits what they're going to be able to buy going forward. But I think you're going to see more and more. Look, we saw, and it's not just in the U.S. I mean, look at Invest up in Canada that got taken out by some shell company that we're told was run by En Bang. So I think you're seeing more and more of it. It's going to continue. It's not ending, and that's good for the hotel business.
And it's interesting because to your point, that China or even the Middle East or others, it's definitely going to be a huge trend going forward. I mean, it has started already. Just realize that 50% of our owners are from overseas. And quite a chunk of those from Asia. And you're talking about China, but there's South Korea as well. And even
Yeah, lots
so, and it's interesting because just about a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine called me from Asia, and he says, well, can you help me buy a chain with hotels? And so we started a conversation, and it was almost a casual conversation, and he says, anywhere between 600 million and 2 billion. So well, that's a pretty wide range, and we want, this many, so it's like scale, so select service or the few sparkle with a few full service, whatever full service means. But definitely they see that as a good diversification strategy. They see that as, if I'm in many markets with many brands, then I sort of hedge my bets, and that's sort of their perception of minimizing or mitigating their risk. So definitely a big trend. They don't completely know yet how to do it, so sometimes they go and buy, the likes of Ampang, but you see also real estate developers, Chinese real estate developers come and build buildings in here. Wanda is one of them, and then you have others that are unknown, but when you dig a little bit, you find that they are gigantic. I was just talking to one of them a couple of days ago, who are doing projects on the West Coast, in New York and elsewhere, and I've never heard of them. And I Googled them, and I'm like, oh my God, what is that? And the guy was the sort of secretary of something of the Communist Party, and he's the chairman. And then he just bought like 5 houses on the West Coast, probably worth $10 million each. Yeah, I'm sure you know. I mean, there's kind of crazy stuff, things that you don't really realize, and there's more than we think. There's more than we think.
On the individual transaction level, I mean, right now, pricing's one thing. In Chicago, it's Chinese money in the Waldorf now. It's German money in London House, which are the 2 biggest transactions we've ever had. So the price point is one thing, can't compete. But the other thing is international funds. They play better into the GP-LP relationship that we live in. And sponsors can go there and kind of get what they want. So that's where they're pitching deals first right now. So that's where it's getting a little bit harder. You're not getting deals first. You can't compete on pricing, and just don't really stand a chance on those sort of transactions.
The cost of capital is different.
Right.
It goes back to why did the Japanese get so involved in the acquisition of in hospitality in the U.S. in the 80s? It was because the yen bond yield was 1.5%. It was real simple. It was a much better deal. It's a hedge. When we look at the low cost of capital that something like non-banking has.
I've spoken a lot. We have 4 students here. Do you guys have any? Do you have any questions for the esteemed panel?
I do. I'd like to.
What's your name?
I'm Alex.
Introduce yourself.
Senior at Michigan State. I'd like to know your input on the new overtime law coming into effect next month.
I just attended a board meeting in Las Vegas, and one of the keys that came up was the IT changes going on in a massive casino company. The entire time and reporting system is being replaced. The entire payroll system is being replaced. Some of that was necessary, but a great deal of it driven by the ability to manage and monitor, not just across the country, but state to state, state labor board by state labor board, the obligations that are presented by the new overtime laws, so that meal breaks, that overtime and sign in and sign out is properly tabulated, and we avoid. It's not so much the cost of overtime, it's managing that in advance of the commitment to overtime and managing the staffing on that basis so that it's anticipated. And big companies avoid huge lawsuits that are generally settled very much in favor of the plaintiff.
Anyone else?
So we're afternoon.
What's your name? What's your name? Your
Sorry.
name and your major and all that stuff.
My name is Audrey Hooney. I'm a junior at Michigan State with a minor in real estate investment management. Allie and I are both graduating spring of 2018, and there's just so much uncertainty going on in the market right now. And I was wondering if any of you have any advice for us.
Hang in there.
Yeah, that's,
What do you say?
Hang in there.
there's always uncertainty. There's never, I remember when I was in your shoes and the market crashed and it was the same day that there was a big fire at the prison, so I walked out of the test and there was black smoke in the market, and I was like, what have I done? And then it happened 4 more times, right? You mentioned all the cycles. I worked for you in 1997. How many cycles have we been through since then? Yeah.
Almost 4 seconds.
It's a roller coaster ride. You'll be fine. Just hang in there.
I think you have to really define, because hospitality is a big, big, big world, from real estate all the way down to operations and across. I think, to me, the most important thing is to focus on find what you like, what you're passionate about, and you may not know it, but just have as many conversations with people like us, or maybe not like us, on defining what you really like, and just go for it and stick to it, rather than get, dispersed a little bit and a little bit, which also happens because you need to try a few things. So I would say find the right thing, the thing that you're passionate about within the industry, and get as much experience and exposure on that, and as much advice and guidance on that, and go for it. Because as you said, markets are always uncertain, and we're never going to live in like a very peaceful and nice, otherwise people wouldn't make money, right? They make money out of uncertainty.
And I'll add this. 10 years from now, this table won't look like this. We all look like we went to the same fraternity. I mean,
well, we had kind of before Mitch stepped in. Kathleen Flores was going to be here, so we did have
one
right?
out of okay. But
agreed. Yeah, that's one of the every conference you go, it's old white dudes.
Who are you calling old?
So
Audrey and there's always grad.
I would add
Good luck
this
financing
too. You've heard some good commentary here, what's hot, what's not. Big full-service hotels, suburban could be the dinosaurs of the near future, but you've also heard about all these slick new lifestyle hotels and boutique hotels and how they're penetrating better than a lot of their competitors. So you owe it to yourself, especially if you want to be in the real estate side of it, take a deeper dive and really understand where are these trends and how can you fit within those in a way that you can win in an ever-changing market.
I think also being, a lot of us are knuckleheads to our old habits, and so being on the forefront of technology and knowing a lot more than what your bosses know, and teaching, being ahead on the tech side, and what are the waves of what is the psychographics of yours and people younger than you, what are they doing, and being aware of these trends will really help differentiate yourself. So when you go in to do your job, you're not just doing just your job, you're adding extra value than what they had anticipated.
And I would say, look for experience, but don't take the safe route. Be willing to fail. You're young enough to take some chances, and if you fall on your face, you got another couple of decades to recover. So don't be afraid to take chances.
Okay, all great points. Last question, I'll get you guys out of here. Most of you, if not all of you, have been to Alice before, right? And there's always a tagline at Alice, something about, I think one year was, don't worry, be happy. One of those.
Ride the wave.
Ride the wave, right? So Alice is in January, start of the year. So Paul, we're going to start down with you. So started other stuff last time. But what is your Alice tag? What's your Alice tagline this year? Next year?
Sit tight and be patient.
Mark.
We live in some extraordinary times where things are, I think, very choppy. So be extraordinary in your decision making and think market by market. It's a corner by corner business. Find the right corners, do the right thing in an ever-changing market.
It's a long time.
Yeah, I don't know if it's gonna
If I were to short that, I cannot.
Mitch, you got something?
Is it cliche to say make hotels great again?
That's a good.
I should have.
Yeah, I'm going to pass. No, I'd say just maybe keep calm and stick to your net rate.
And on a similar thought, it's time to get to work, right? It's easier to do this job when everything's rising, right? It's time to really focus on managing.
Hustle.
There you go.
We're cruising in calm waters. Don't become complacent.
There you go.
If it were easy, everybody would do it.
It could always be worse.
There's an optimist.
I would say boutique hotels for millennial hipster foodies who might want to stay at Airbnb and draw a big red line through the entire thing and say, don't talk about any of that.
Like Paul, we're pretty disciplined right now, so I would say the tagline is some of the best deals are the ones that you don't do.
All right. Well, on that note, I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Michigan State. Thank you to Access Point Financial for sponsoring, and thank you all. Thanks to the students, and enjoy the weekend. Yeah.